Everyone, Cliff DeWitt here. And on this recording, and possibly one more, or maybe two more, depending how far we get here, we're going to be introducing the subject of fiscal policy. Now, up to this point, just to see how this fits in, we know from a couple chapters ago that the economy should be working here at kind of the optimum level here, which is equal to the GDP, real GDP level, that is the potential of the economy's production at long-run aggregate supply. Well, we know that oftentimes that doesn't happen. In fact, it happens. We don't meet the full production lots of times, although it gets pretty close usually if you plot it over time. But we have gaps at times. Sometimes there is a situation where the optimum production level is exceeded. Now, that sounds good, but it puts a strain on resources, and it's something that the economy cannot successfully sustain over time, because it tends to raise the prices and to an unhealthy level. This is what we call, of course, an inflationary gap. On the other hand, we have a number of situations where the actual output of the economy is less than it should be, less than optimum level. And in that case, we have unemployment, we have inefficiencies, things like that. So in this case, we have a gap on the recession side, where the production is less than what it should be. And so after defining these things, we were told that to correct a recessionary gap, the government and the Fed would put in what is called an expansionary policy to kickstart the economy. And then, of course, if there's an inflationary gap, the Feds, the government, and the Federal Reserve System basically wishes to cool off the economy a little bit. And so they have a contractionary policy. Now, each of these policies, the expansionary and the contractionary, which we didn't define in those chapters, basically is aimed at aggregate demand, to manipulate aggregate demand. In the case of a recession where they want to kickstart the economy out, what they'll do is they'll do policies that make aggregate demand increase, and so it will shift out towards the full employment level, or the maximum optimum output of the economy. Now, in the case of a contractionary policy, they will again target aggregate demand, put in policies that will tend to cool off aggregate demand and to shift it down to the left until it closes off the gap and reaches the maximum sustainable level of production. Now, there's two types of policies, one of which we've already talked about, that the government puts into effect. One is monetary policy, and that, of course, is in the domain of the Federal Reserve System. They will, depending if they want to expand aggregate demand or move it out, they will do policies, or they will try to increase the money supply through sales of bonds, or through lowering interest rates of their loaning to other banks, or the federal funds rate, which is banks loaning to other banks, or at times, they don't do this much, but at times they could lower the required reserve ratio, which would be a monetary policy of moving out aggregate demand. Monetary policies deal with the quantity of money that's out there. It's not a direct infusion into aggregate demand, but it's sort of focusing on the money supply. But the effects of that are pretty just as good, or maybe more than fiscal policy. In the case of a contractionary policy, what they will do is they will try to raise interest rates by lowering the money supply, and they do this basically by selling bonds and by raising the various rates of interest rates that they use to loan to banks, or they let banks loan to each other. Or a recent thing that they have done that has not been done previous to the last few years is that the Fed, to pursue a contractionary policy, has been paying interest on the reserve sums that the bank either hold at the bank or with the Fed. And that sort of curtails loaning a little bit and sort of curtails the money supply. Well, we go to fiscal policy. That was kind of a quick and dirty summation, well, not too dirty, but a quick summation of monetary policies dealing with the money supply. Well, in fiscal policies, the government, and the regular government, we know that the Federal Reserve System is sort of technically part of government, but it's not, it's pretty autonomous from the political influence of Congress or the president. The president appoints the chairman of the Fed, but he can't really do much about it to influence the Fed's policies. Okay. Well, in terms of fiscal policy, it's a direct infusion into GDP or into the system. Okay. And it's done by the government itself. Congress, president, not the judicial, but they're kind of watching to see if Congress and the president supposedly did it all right. The similarities to fiscal policy and monetary policy is it's generally aimed at aggregate demand to either increase aggregate demand in the case of a recession, an expansionary policy, or to cool off the economy in the case of an inflationary gap. So essentially, a fiscal policy for the government is to either spend or not spend or curtail spending. Of course, the government will spend whether they curtail most of their spending or not. It's a huge part of the economy. But what the federal government will do is they will either increase government purchases or increase other government spending, such as, and we want to write this down here. I hope you have this. If not, rewind to me. The government can do a number of things in terms of fiscal policy. One thing, if they want to increase aggregate demand, they may increase transfer payments. Now, what are transfer payments? Transfer payments are defined as government paying to individuals or entities of some kind that do not perform a service to earn the money, or they don't, it's not an exchange for a service. And again, you've probably heard me ranting about this in the class, but I thought I'd rant again. That's what they define, that's what they classify Social Security benefits as. It's just free money that we receive for not doing anything. So a lot of us haven't, the working 40 years till retirement age must not be, much of anything. But anyway, transfer payments are that. There's other transfer payments that are involve unemployment benefits, other things such as welfare. There's other things, but anyway, like that. That's transfer payments. And if the government wants to increase aggregate demand, they might kick up the transfer payments a little bit. And they've done that in terms of recessions. Mr. Obama had a stimulus package where he gave grants and credits to first-time home buyers, things like that, which that's not actually a transfer payment. Transfer payments are, again, the welfare, unemployment benefits, Social Security benefits, that sort of thing, which Social Security benefits, some of those are taxable. Isn't that nice? But anyway, that brings us into taxes. Taxes, of course, are basically the way that the government gets revenues. I have some figures on taxes that are kind of interesting. Well, I think I'll do that in the next recording because we don't really have time. But just to state how taxes are part of a fiscal policy, that if the government wishes to increase aggregate demand, they will cut taxes at times for individuals, income tax rates, which will increase disposable income, which will increase investment and consumption. Okay. They can do things like put an investment tax credit where a firm, if they invest in new equipment or invest in something else, it will lower their tax burden. And we'll get into what the corporate tax burden is compared to the individuals over time in the next recording. So, if they want to increase aggregate demand, they'll lower the tax rate. If they, both individual and business, excise, that sort of thing, and we'll get into that. If they want to cool off the economy a little bit and for fear of inflation, they will raise tax rates. Okay. So that, again, we've gotten to this point in this recording about a definition of fiscal policies. Fiscal policy basically is government spending or cutting back on government spending. The government cutting back on sources of income, on revenue a little bit, or the government increasing sources of revenue. So thanks a lot, and we will talk to you very soon. So you can go get a drink or something. Thanks.